The morning of May 19th, 1536 dawned cold and grey over the Tower of London. On the damp scaffold stood a woman who had once captivated a king, a queen whose wit and ambition had changed the very fabric of England. Anne Boleyn, her neck stretched, beneath the blade of a French swordsman, brought in for this single grim purpose. The crowd stood in suffocating silence. Nobles, servants, and curious commoners pressed shoulder to shoulder, straining for a glimpse of history's most shocking execution. The Frenchman whispered a distraction to her, and then, in an instant, steel carved silence into finality. A head rolled, a body twitched, and the Tudor dynasty, soaked in blood, marched forward. But this was not the story of one queen alone. It was the story of a king consumed by obsessions so dark, so grotesque, that they reshaped a nation. For behind the executioner's sword stood the towering figure of Henry VIII, King of England, a man who began his reign as Europe's golden prince, admired for his athleticism, his music, his charm. Yet by the end, he was a bloated, festering tyrant, feared not only by his enemies, but by his own court, his wives, even his children. Henry VIII's reign is remembered for his 6 wives, the birth of the Church of England, and his volatile appetite for power. But beneath the gilded portrait of the Renaissance monarch lies a nightmare far darker, a man enslaved by his obsessions, obsessed with producing a male heir, obsessed with stamping out betrayal, real or imagined, obsessed with wealth, gluttony, and extravagant displays of power, obsessed above all with controlling life and death itself. This was no ordinary king. This was a monarch whose mind and body decayed before the eyes of his people, a man whose paranoia left tens of thousands executed, whose lust tore apart his marriages, whose illnesses festered into madness. Imagine yourself in that court for a moment. You are a courtier, dressed in velvet and jewels, summoned before the king. You kneel as Henry glares down at you, his once handsome face now swollen, his eyes bloodshot with suspicion. One wrong word, even a whisper, could see you branded, a traitor, dragged to the tower and left to rot before your head joins the others spiked on London Bridge. What would you have done? Would you have risked speaking truth or survived in silence? The early 1500s were a time of upheaval. England was still a fragile kingdom, only decades removed from the Wars of the Roses, when rival factions had torn the crown from each other in brutal civil wars. Henry's father, Henry VII, had secured the throne by blood and cunning, but the Tudor dynasty was far from secure. The young Henry VIII inherited a crown balanced on a knife's edge. Every decision, every alliance, every child born or lost could decide the fate of England's future. And so, the obsessions began. At first, they were wrapped in charm. Henry dazzled foreign courts, jousted in glittering tournaments, and wooed women with poetry and song. But behind the smiles lurked a darker hunger, the desperate need for a son to carry on his dynasty. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, could not provide one. Her sons died in infancy. Only a daughter, Mary, survived. And for Henry, that was not enough. Thus began the cycle of marriages and annulments, of executions and betrayals. Henry would rip his country from the Catholic Church, plunge England into religious turmoil, and leave behind a legacy soaked in fear. This documentary will uncover the shocking obsessions that drove Henry VIII from golden prince to monstrous tyrant, his fixation on heirs, his descent into paranoia, his grotesque physical decline, his gluttony, and his thirst for blood. Along the way, we will step into the dark corridors of Tudor power, where every whisper could be fatal, and where one man's madness reshaped history itself. But be warned, the story you thought you knew about Henry VIII is only the surface. The real horror is yet to come. Henry VIII ruled not only with a crown upon his head, but with a sword suspended over every neck in England. His was a kingdom of glittering courts and velvet gowns, Yet beneath the polished surface, fear was the true currency of power. From the earliest days of his reign, Henry understood that the quickest way to command loyalty was through terror. Executions became theatre, staged with precision to remind nobles and peasants alike of the price of defiance. Heads spiked on London Bridge, traitors quartered and displayed, whispers silenced by the lash of the king's justice. The message was clear: defy Henry, and you will be erased. But fear was not just a political tool, it was an obsession. Henry trusted no one completely. His closest advisors rose like shooting stars, only to be hurled back to earth when they shone too brightly. Cardinal Wolsey, once the king's right hand, died disgraced. Thomas More, the pious scholar, lost his head for refusing to bend to Henry's will. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne Boleyn's downfall, would one day face the same fate. Each betrayal, each execution fed Henry's paranoia until his court resembled a hunting ground where loyalty was tested with blood. And then there was sex and marriage, tools of power no less brutal than the axe. Henry's wives were not companions. They were pawns in a desperate dynastic game. Catherine of Aragon endured decades of humiliation before being cast aside. Her marriage annulled so Henry could pursue Anne Boleyn. When Anne, too, failed to give him a son, she became expendable, condemned on charges of adultery and even incest. Jane Seymour, his third wife, provided the coveted male heir but paid with her life in childbirth. Henry consumed his queens as he consumed his meals, hungrily, impatiently, discarding what no longer pleased him. This relentless cycle reveals more than political maneuvering. It exposes a man whose paranoia extended into his bedchamber. He could not tolerate the idea that fate, or women, might rob him of a son. And so he wielded not only the executioner's axe, but the power of the church itself, reshaping religion in England to justify his obsessions. When Rome refused him, Henry declared himself head of the Church of England, a spiritual tyrant as well as a political one. To oppose him was not just treason, it was heresy. The king's paranoia was stoked, further by rituals of humiliation and torture. Prisoners were paraded through the streets, their bodies broken, their crimes shouted for all to hear. Executions became public spectacles designed to crush dissent before it could fester. Even nobles were not spared. A royal courtier could dine with the king one evening and be led to the Tower the next, his fortune and life extinguished in a moment of royal wrath. Imagine the suffocating anxiety, every word weighed, every glance measured, every smile forced. A wrong word could mean your children orphaned, your estate seized, your body desecrated for all to see. Then, in 1536, a catastrophe struck that would turn Henry's paranoia into a consuming fire. During a joust, the sport he once dominated, the king was thrown from his horse. The massive stallion fell upon him, crushing his leg. Though he survived, the injury never healed. His once powerful body festered with ulcers that refused to close, leaving him in constant agony. Pain became his daily companion. Courtiers reported the smell of rotting flesh wafting through his chambers. Henry's athleticism, once a source of pride, was replaced by immobility, frustration, and fury, and pain breeds paranoia. Historians argue that the trauma of the accident marked the turning point of Henry's reign. Where once he had been reckless, but charming, now he became tyrannical, cruel, quick to rage, slow to trust. His courtiers whispered that he was a king transformed, not by destiny, but by disease and despair. This physical decline mirrored the erosion of his sanity. Each year, Henry withdrew further into suspicion, convinced of betrayal at every turn. His body grew grotesque, his appetites monstrous, his temper uncontrollable. His obsessions, with heirs, with loyalty, with control, metastasized into something darker. The madness of a man who could command life and death with a word, and who increasingly saw ghosts of betrayal in every shadow. But the true horror was still to come. For paranoia, when mixed with absolute power, does not simply destroy a man, it destroys everyone around him. And soon, Henry would unleash his most shocking act of obsession, the execution of a queen. The year was 1536, and the Tudor court trembled under a storm no one dared to name aloud. Henry VIII had once risked everything to claim Anne Boleyn as his queen, defying the Pope, tearing his kingdom from the Catholic Church, and plunging England into religious and political chaos. Yet now, just 3 years later, Anne stood accused of treason, adultery, and incest. It was a scandal designed not merely to remove a queen, but to obliterate her name, her family, and her legacy. The charges were grotesque. Anne was accused of seducing multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The supposed liaisons were described in, and betrayal, in Henry's mind, required blood. Anne's arrest was sudden, brutal. She was seized at Greenwich Palace, confused and trembling, and taken to the Tower of London. Ironically, the very place where she had been crowned queen just 3 years earlier. Courtiers who once bowed to her now scattered like frightened birds, desperate not to be seen in her company. Some of her closest ladies were forced to spy on her, recording her words for Cromwell, the king's enforcer. The trial was a spectacle. A queen, daughter of a noble house, brought low before a hostile jury. Anne defended herself with dignity, denying the charges with calm precision. Those who heard her said she spoke not as a desperate woman, but as a queen still conscious of her crown. Yet it was useless. The verdict had been written before she stepped into the chamber. Guilty. Death by burning or beheading. Henry chose mercy, if it can be called such. Anne would not burn. She would be executed by sword, a cleaner death than the axe. The king even imported a specialist executioner from Calais, known for his swiftness. But mercy in this case was only another theatre of control. It allowed Henry to present himself as a magnanimous ruler, even as he destroyed the woman he once adored. On the morning of May 19th, Anne walked onto the scaffold dressed in a grey gown, her dark hair tucked beneath a linen cap. She spoke softly to the crowd, declaring her innocence but submitting to the king's will. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice clear, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." There were no screams, no wild pleas. Anne Boleyn faced death with unnerving calm, her dignity intact, even as the shadow of the blade loomed over her. Witnesses reported her praying softly, repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord, Jesus, receive my soul." The executioner raised his sword. With a practiced trick, he called out for his assistant to hand him something, causing Anne to turn her head. In that split second of distraction, he swung. One clean stroke. Her head fell, her body collapsed, and a gasp rippled through the crowd. For the courtiers who watched, it was a lesson written in blood. No one, not even a queen, was safe from Henry's obsessions. The shock reverberated through Europe. Foreign ambassadors wrote in disbelief that a king could so coldly discard his wife. To Henry, however, it was simply necessity. Within days, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, Anne's former lady-in-waiting. His appetite for control, for heirs, and for blood knew no pause. Imagine yourself in that crowd, the cold wind on your face, the sight of a queen's lifeless body at your feet. Would you have whispered sympathy for Anne, risking the tower yourself? Or would you have cheered with hollow loyalty, praying the king's gaze never fell on you? This was more than the execution of a woman. It was the execution of innocence, of truth, of trust. Anne's death was a turning point, marking the moment Henry's obsessions fully eclipsed his humanity. But in the gilded halls of Whitehall Palace, another horror brewed. For if a king could kill his queen, what chance did ministers, nobles, or even childhood friends have when paranoia whispered in his ear. The axe had fallen once, and it would fall again. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not merely a private tragedy, it was a performance, staged for the eyes of the world. And behind the curtain lurked layers of betrayal and political gamesmanship, more twisted than any Shakespearean drama. At the heart of it all was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief, minister. Once the architect of Anne's rise, Cromwell orchestrated her fall with surgical precision. He compiled the charges, assembled the witnesses, and ensured the outcome was never in doubt. Why? Because even the most powerful queen in England could become an obstacle. Anne opposed Cromwell's policies, clashed with him over foreign alliances, and threatened his influence over the king. To survive in Henry's court, Cromwell learned, you did not simply serve the king, you anticipated his darkest desires and made them real. The whispers of court suggested Cromwell promised Henry something no one else dared: freedom from Anne. He fed the king's paranoia with tales of adultery, betrayal, and even witchcraft. He gave Henry the one thing he craved. Above all, justification. And with Henry's blessing, Cromwell unleashed a tidal wave of accusations that swept through the palace like a plague. But Cromwell was not alone. The Tudor court was a labyrinth of alliances, spies, and shifting loyalties. Every nobleman measured his survival against the fall of another. Anne's enemies, the conservative faction still loyal to Catherine of Aragon, and those uneasy with the break from Rome, seized their chance. They whispered into Cromwell's ear. They spread rumours. Through servants' corridors, they ensured the Queen's enemies were seated in judgment. When Anne fell, it was not Henry's blade alone, but the sharpened knives of countless rivals, each taking their slice of vengeance. And still, beyond politics, there was the role of religion. Henry's marriage to Anne had been justified as divine will, a new queen to bring forth a son. Yet when she failed, the same scripture that once blessed her was now turned against her. Priests thundered that Anne had tempted the king into sin. Superstitious minds muttered of curses, of God's wrath upon the land. Religion was never far from Henry's obsessions. It was the mask behind which lust and power could be sanctified. Court gossip magnified the scandal until it seemed to fill every chamber of Whitehall Palace. Servants whispered of Anne's supposed lovers. Ladies-in-waiting repeated stories of jealous rages and wild tantrums. Some even suggested Henry had begun to believe Anne had ensnared him with sorcery, that her sharp eyes and quick wit were marks of a witch. These whispers were not idle chatter. In Henry's England, rumour was weaponized. A careless word could condemn a man or raise suspicion against a queen. The court was not merely a stage of grandeur, it was a theatre of terror. And terror reshaped alliances. Nobles who once bowed to Anne now trampled her memory to save their own skins. Even her family was not spared humiliation. Her brother, George, accused of incest, was dragged into the same farcical trial and executed. Their blood marked the downfall of an entire house. But power in Henry's court was fickle. Cromwell, triumphant in orchestrating Anne's death, soon rose to unprecedented heights. He became the king's indispensable hand, reorganizing the church, enriching the crown, and tightening the machinery of royal power. Yet the courtiers who toasted him in 1536 would one day watch him fall just as swiftly. For in Henry's England, there was no safety, only the illusion of it. Imagine the atmosphere of those palace chambers, gold-draped halls echoing not with laughter, but with whispers. Courtiers smiling with painted calm while fear gnawed their insides. Every banquet, every mask, every dance was shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow the king might see treason in your eyes. And treason meant the tower, the rack, the scaffold. Even the king's daughters, Mary and the infant Elizabeth, were pawns in this lethal game. Declared illegitimate by their father, they grew up under a cloud of suspicion, their fates tied to whichever wife currently warmed the king's bed. The very bloodlines of the dynasty were subject to the churn of paranoia and ambition. The hypocrisy was staggering. Henry painted himself as God's chosen ruler, the moral guardian of his people. Yet his court was a den of adultery, betrayal, and political murder, all sanctified under the guise of law and religion. In this contradiction lay the true genius of Tudor propaganda, to cloak tyranny and righteousness, to disguise obsession as divine right. But what of the people beyond the palace walls? Word of Anne's fall spread through taverns and marketplaces. Some rejoiced, believing the concubine who had displaced Catherine of Aragon was finally punished. Others whispered, uneasily, sensing that if a queen could be destroyed so easily, no one was safe. Fear seeped from the court into the very soul of the nation. And yet, amidst the terror, Henry's obsessions only grew. The blood of Anne Boleyn had not satisfied his hunger for control. He would wed Jane Seymour within days, chasing once more, the elusive dream of a son. But obsession is a fire that consumes rather than warms. And soon, Henry's body, his mind, and his kingdom would bear the scars. The fall of Anne Boleyn was not confined to the gilded walls of Whitehall or the blood-stained scaffold of the Tower. It rippled outward, shaking the very foundations of English society. For when a queen could be destroyed on the whim of her husband, when the church itself could be reshaped to suit a king's lust, what hope did ordinary men and women have against such absolute power? Among the common people, reactions were divided, but fear was universal. Some cheered Anne's downfall, calling her the concubine who had stolen the crown from Catherine of Aragon. In taverns, where ale loosened tongues, there were whispers that Anne's death was divine punishment, that God himself had struck her down for leading the king into sin. Others, more cautious, muttered their unease. If queens could fall, how secure were the rest of them? The shadow of the scaffold stretched far beyond London. The nobility, meanwhile, lived in a constant state of dread. They had seen one of their own, a woman from a powerful family, raised high to queenship, dragged through the mud and cast aside. They had watched Anne's brother George once, a courtly poet and diplomat, branded a traitor and executed on false charges. To the peers of England, the lesson was clear. Status and birth offered no protection. Loyalty was demanded, but loyalty was never enough. Religion, once the bedrock of society, had become a tool of manipulation. Henry's break from Rome had been justified in sermons as God's will, a righteous act to free England from papal corruption. But when Anne failed to give him a son, the same preachers thundered that her execution was also God's will. The sacred became the servant of the profane. If the king wished it, priests could conjure a moral explanation from scripture. For the people, this hypocrisy bred confusion and fear. Was the crown truly divinely guided, or was it simply a mask for one man's obsessions? The role of myth and superstition cannot be ignored. Many believed Anne had bewitched Henry, that her black eyes and sharp wit marked her as a witch. Her miscarriage of a malformed fetus was whispered about in horrified tones, a supposed sign of unnatural sin. The line between divine judgment and royal propaganda blurred until the people could no longer tell one from the other. Fear of witchcraft, fear of God's wrath, fear of the king himself, all combined into a culture of terror, and executions themselves became social rituals. The scaffold was not merely a tool of justice. It was theatre, spectacle, a grim form of entertainment and instruction. Crowds gathered to witness the deaths of nobles and traitors. Children perched on their parents' shoulders to watch the swing of the axe. These spectacles reinforced the message. The king's justice was absolute. To live in Tudor England was to live with death as public ceremony, a reminder carved into the collective psyche. Yet, amidst the blood and fear, seeds of resistance stirred. In 1536, the same year Anne was executed, rebellion erupted in the north. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising of commoners, priests, and even some nobles, demanded an end to Henry's religious upheavals and the restoration of the old faith. Tens of thousands marched beneath the banner of Christ, chanting prayers, even as they threatened the king's power. Henry, ever paranoid, crushed the rebellion with merciless force. Hundreds were executed, their bodies left to rot as warnings. The uprising failed, but it revealed a truth Henry could not ignore. Beneath the surface of obedience, resentment boiled. The cultural scars ran deep. Families lived in fear of speaking openly, for words could be twisted into treason. Plays, poems, and songs had to be carefully measured, lest they be seen as criticisms of the king. Even laughter could be dangerous if it occurred at the wrong moment. In such a world, silence became survival. Imagine being a humble villager, watching a column of rebels march past, chanting against the king. Do you join them, risking death? Or do you kneel at the altar and pray that God spares your family from Henry's wrath? What would you have done? Henry's obsessions, his need for heirs, his paranoia, his cruelty, reshaped the culture of an entire nation. Religion became politicized. Executions became ritual. Silence became law. The people learned that in Tudor England, the line between justice and tyranny was drawn not by God, not by law, but by the shifting will of a king consumed by his darkest desires. And yet, as the years passed, Henry's obsessions only deepened. His kingdom was scarred, but the most terrifying transformation was still ahead. For the king himself, once a golden prince, was rotting from within. By the late 1530s, the golden prince of Europe was gone. In his place stood a king whose body was breaking down, whose mind was unraveling, and whose obsessions had metastasized into something monstrous. This was the turning point, the moment when Henry VIII's reign crossed from paranoia into terror, from authority into madness. The decline began with the jousting accident of 1536. Henry's armored horse collapsed onto him during a tournament, crushing his leg and knocking him unconscious for hours. For weeks, courtiers whispered that the king might not survive. Though he recovered, his body never healed. His leg festered with ulcers that oozed and refused to close. The smell of decay haunted his chambers. Surgeons lanced the wounds again and again, releasing pus and blood, but relief was temporary. Each step became agony, until Henry, once the very image of athletic vigor, could scarcely walk. Pain became his constant companion, and with pain came fury. Historians believe his head injury may also have damaged his brain, warping his temper, feeding his paranoia. Where once Henry had been mercurial, now he was terrifying. A laugh could shift to a rage in a heartbeat. His courtiers learned to study his eyes, his tone, his silences, desperate to anticipate which Henry they would face that day, the jovial monarch or the executioner's shadow. As his body swelled, so did his appetites. Denied the thrill of sport, Henry turned to food. Banquets groaned under the weight of roasted meats, sugared delicacies, and oceans of wine. Chroniclers recorded that he grew so obese, he required mechanical hoists to move him. By his final years, his waist measured over 50 inches. He was a man trapped within his own body, imprisoned by his gluttony and pain. Yet this physical collapse only sharpened his obsession with power. If his body was failing, his will to dominate would not. But it was not only the king who suffered. His obsessions spilled outward, consuming his people. In 1536, the same year of his accident, rebellion erupted in the north. The Pilgrimage of Grace was the greatest popular uprising of his reign. 40,000 men, women, and priests marching under the banner of Christ, demanding the restoration of Catholicism, the end of monastic closures, and an end to Henry's tyrannical policies. Their banners bore sacred images, their chants were prayers, but their anger was unmistakable. They saw Henry not as God's chosen king, but as a tyrant tearing England's soul apart. For a brief moment, Henry's power faltered. Surrounded by rebels, he was forced to promise mercy and reform. But mercy was a mask. Once the armies dispersed, he unleashed vengeance. Hundreds were executed, including noble leaders and humble priests. Bodies dangled from gallows across the north, grim reminders of what defiance cost. The Pilgrimage of Grace proved the people's discontent, but it also gave Henry license to drown his enemies in blood. This was the turning point for England's culture of fear. If a queen could fall, if priests could be hanged, if whole counties could be punished, then no one was safe. Even the nobility, once Henry's partners in power, became prisoners of his moods. They smiled at banquets, toasted his health, and whispered prayers at night that their names would not appear on a warrant by morning. And Henry himself, he was unraveling. Modern scholars have suggested he may have suffered from MacLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder linked to his suspected Kell-positive blood type. Symptoms include muscle weakness, paranoia, and psychological instability. Whether or not this diagnosis is true, the effect was the same. A king who once charmed Europe now ruled through fear and suspicion. By the 1540s, the once vibrant monarch had become a spectre of rot. His legs were so swollen that courtiers feared they might burst. His moods darkened until executions became almost casual. 2 more wives would die. Countless nobles and servants followed. He surrounded himself with flatterers, yet trusted no one. Even his children were pawns, declared legitimate or illegitimate at his whim. Imagine standing in his presence during these years, the stench of rotting flesh hanging in the air. The massive figure slumped on a throne, clad in jewels, that strained against his swollen frame, his eyes scanning the hall for signs of betrayal. One glance could mean elevation to power or condemnation to death. Would you speak, or would you bow in silence? This was the turning point not only for Henry, but for England. The line between monarch and monster blurred. Pain, paranoia, and obsession had transformed him into a tyrant who ruled less with charisma than with terror. And though his body was failing, his grip on power was unyielding. The king was rotting from the inside out, but his obsessions were still hungry, and the cost of feeding them would shape England's destiny for generations. When Henry VIII finally died in January of 1547, England did not breathe a sigh of relief. It exhaled the stale air of fear. The king's bloated corpse, so swollen it reportedly burst in its coffin, was a grotesque metaphor for his reign. A man who had consumed everything and left behind a kingdom scarred, yet unbroken. The consequences of his obsessions were immense. His desperate quest for a male heir had fractured the church, torn England from Rome, and left the nation in religious chaos. In his wake came a succession of children, each ruling briefly, each shaped by the scars he left behind. Edward VI, his long-sought son, ruled only 6 years before dying young. Mary I restored Catholicism through fire and blood. Elizabeth I, the daughter Henry once dismissed as a disappointment, politically, Henry's reign established a precedent of absolute monarchy enforced by fear. He had expanded the definition of treason so broadly that words, gestures, even thoughts could condemn a man to death. Future rulers would inherit not just the crown, but the machinery of surveillance and terror he perfected. The lesson to courtiers was etched in blood. Kings were not merely rulers, they were forces of life and death, unpredictable and absolute. Culturally, the nation bore deep wounds. Entire monasteries had been dissolved, their treasures seized, their monks cast out, their libraries burned. Ordinary men and women saw the landscapes of their faith stripped bare, centuries-old abbeys reduced to rubble, sacred relics smashed. The English Reformation was not a clean break. It was a cultural amputation, performed with Henry's axe. Historians and chroniclers wrestled with Henry's legacy from the moment of his death. Some painted him as a new David, God's chosen king, a mighty figure who had freed England from papal tyranny. Others whispered of his cruelty, his appetites, his descent into madness. To many, he was both, a ruler of great power and a tyrant who fed that power with blood. His contradictions became the very image of Tudor monarchy, splendor intertwined with terror. The evidence of his obsessions survives in stone and parchment. In Hampton Court Palace, one can still walk the echoing halls he built to display his magnificence, his tapestries woven with golden thread to proclaim divine favor. In state archives, records of executions stretch into the tens of thousands. A grim roll call of those who fell beneath his paranoia. Even his body, exhumed centuries later, told the tale. Bones warped by obesity, teeth ravaged by decay, the corpse of a king undone by his own excesses. But Henry's greatest legacy was psychological. He had taught a nation that fear was governance, that silence was survival. The trauma of his reign seeped into England's political culture, where distrust, betrayal, and paranoia lingered long after his death. Nobles remembered that even the highest among them could fall. Commoners remembered that rebellion was answered with gallows and fire. And generations of rulers remembered that the crown could be preserved not by love, but by fear. Imagine the weight of living in that shadow. A century later, when Charles Leicester faced execution in 1649, many recalled the precedent set by Henry. Kings, once untouchable, were no longer immortal. Tyranny had consequences. Power, when devoured by obsession, could consume itself. And yet, despite the horror, Henry VIII endures in memory, larger than life, impossible to ignore. His image, towering in portraits, still radiates dominance. His story remains both a warning and a fascination. The tale of a man who began as a prince of promise and ended as a tyrant rotting from within. The consequences of his obsessions did not die with him. They echo still in the churches that stand where abbeys once fell, in the myth of Tudor majesty, in the uneasy recognition that power unchecked becomes power unhinged. Henry VIII's legacy is not simply history. It is a haunting reminder of how obsession shapes nations and how tyranny carves scars that never truly fade. The blade fell, and Anne Boleyn's head rolled into the straw. That image, a queen cut down at her husband's command, became the defining symbol of Henry VIII's obsessions. It was not just a moment of execution. It was the embodiment of tyranny. Love turned to loathing. Power wielded as cruelty. Paranoia masked as justice. Henry VIII's reign is often remembered for its spectacle. The 6 wives, the break with Rome, the palaces dripping with gold. But beneath the velvet and the jewels lies a nightmare. A man who devoured his wives, his friends, his country, and ultimately himself. A king whose body rotted while his mind descended into suspicion and fear. And yet, his story is not locked in the 16th century. The psychology of obsession, the lust for heirs, the paranoia of betrayal, the hunger for control, is not confined to Tudor palaces. We see it echoed across history, in rulers who cling to power through violence, in leaders who bend religion and law to their will, in regimes that silence dissent with the cold certainty of fear. Henry's England was a stage where the drama of tyranny played out in full view, but it was also a mirror, reflecting human tendencies that still lurk in the corridors of power today. The haunting question remains, was Henry VIII insane or simply the product of unchecked authority? Did his injuries and possible genetic disorders warp his mind, or did absolute power itself corrupt him? Chroniclers could only speculate. Historians still debate. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most disturbing truth of all.